Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is my slow march of the penguins through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author. And we've been mostly stuck in the ancient world of Greece and Rome because a while ago I did a vague organization of these shelves. It largely only applies to the ancient world, and then it falls apart again. And I can't decide whether I want to go through and organize these books first before I get to them in the Daily Penguin, or whether I want to just let the chips fall where they may. Uh, I would put the question to you, but I've already had four different people have emailed me. I leave my email on my videos, so feel free to email me about anything. But four different people in four different countries have emailed me in the last week with a horrifying suggestion. Simply horrifying. They have pleaded in a couple of cases, what if I were to do a library tour in 2020 just exactly the way I'm doing these Daily Penguins, where I do one book at a time for 20 minutes in great detail about the book, the author, the reception history, and my own personal history with the book. Not just for Penguins, but for all the books in my library. It's just horrifying. I predicted something of the kind when we were doing our 2019 library tour. I predicted that by the time it was over, you'd want to start over again. For right now, we are concentrating on Penguin Classics. And right now we are in the ancient world. I, if left to my own devices, would talk about the ancient Romans until the cows came home, and started to do that. So I've been compensating this week by talking about ancient Greeks. We did Herodotus. We did Thucydides. And the two of them are sort of the polar opposite founding fathers of the whole discipline of history. And today we're doing Xenophon, who is... who wrote in his Hellenica, this is the Penguin Classic, The History of My Times is his book, the Hellenica, wrote to actually continue Thucydides. He starts the book right where Thucydides stops, and clearly admired Thucydides and wanted to write in his style. And he does his best. He does his best. Xenophon was of the next generation, and was a fan of Sparta, Athens' great enemy. In the history of Thucydides, and that didn't win him any friends in Athens, so he spent a lot of his time as an exile, a lot of his life as an exile, living in other cities comfortably. Not you never get a sense, I never get a sense in Xenophon's writing of the bitterness that usually attends to exiles in the ancient world. And it was a mild enough ideological disagreement so that he could spend the last 10 years of his life back home in Athens. But he spent his whole life writing. He had money-making estates, so he didn't need to do anything except write. So he wrote a lot, and the Hellenica is a little problematic, to use the modern word, because we don't. You don't want to despise anything that you get from the ancient world. All of it is valuable in its own way. All of it has kernels, at least, and I have liked the Hellenica quite a bit as a reading experience. This is a translation, an old translation for Penguin Classics by Rex Warner, who's a translator we've seen before. That is, I believe, a Roman fresco, or close enough, on the cover. And in this particular volume, I don't think Warner really gets Xenophon. I don't think he really. There seems to be a distinct discrepancy between the marching cadence of the translator and the marching cadence of the writer. You can tell that. You can spot it a mile away when you get used to reading translations. And I do here. I'm not sure. This mass market paperback is very old. And it's also a rare Penguin where the binding is stiff. We've seen on this Daily Penguin tour, mass market paperbacks every bit as old as this one that are still as spry as the day they were made. This thing, I don't think I could read it. I think it would crack apart if I did. And I don't, see, it's already starting to crack apart. And I don't know, I'm not sure if Rex Warner's is still the translation that Penguin uses for Xenophon, because I don't have all of Xenophon, and haven't really had a great yearning, to either. Because although he models himself on Thucydides, he's not as readable as Thucydides. And although he affects in his books, even in his history, the air of a sort of landed grandee, a sort of relaxed, principled inquiry into the past, I've never found him any more likable company as a writer than I have found Thucydides. So this book has the worst of both worlds. There's no personality here on the page to intrigue me, and there's also the distinct feeling of a second rater trying to be a first rater. I mean, you only have to read this book right after or right before you read Thucydides to realize that even if you don't like Thucydides personally, he's doing a fine job, a finer job. But fortunately, this is not the histories that Xenophon wrote. There's another Penguin volume in addition to this, but fortunately, I mean, they have their vivid moments. This book doesn't particularly have all that many vivid moments, but his other book of history does. But fortunately, these aren't the only things that we have from him. Penguin also has a volume. This is a newer trade paperback called Conversations of Socrates, because Xenophon, like Plato, was a student of Socrates. And like Plato and a bunch of other people whose works don't survive, he tried to memorialize Socrates after the great philosopher's death. He tried to recapture the conversations, recapture the atmosphere that was around the great man, and also cast him as a semi-fictional character in other inquiries, in other philosophical discussions. And I think Xenophon does a fine job of it, just fine. And this Penguin trade paperback is by Robin Waterfield. Yeah, it's translated by Robin Waterfield and Hugh Tredennick. Robin Waterfield does a lot of translations for the Oxford World Classics. This is a translation for Penguin, and it doesn't just have Xenophon's Socrates bits. If I remember correctly, it has the Defense of Socrates, it has the Memoirs of Socrates, but it also has something called the Dinner Party and something called the Estate Manager. And those are fascinating glimpses into history, exactly the sort of thing you want, that you wish lots of ancient writers had the humility, or maybe the perspective to do, which is to pause from the highfalutin philosophical discussions in order to describe the world around you under the assumption that you would be read long after that world had disappeared, and that the worlds to come would be interested in little details of your world. That we saw when we were looking at our Roman writers how valuable they can be for that very thing, even if they themselves aren't valuable for much else. I don't think, for instance, that the letters of Pliny the Younger have much to recommend them beyond that, but they are full of that. They're full of everyday lived details of at least a certain class of ordinary person in the Roman Empire. And you get a lot in here. I have read this volume a couple of times and really liked it, although oddly enough, I don't know, I can't help it. I don't believe that it's Xenophon himself, but oddly enough, this is another Penguin. This is a trade paperback from 50 years later than this old one, and yet it still is stiff. It still behaves like a normal trade paperback instead of like a Penguin trade paperback. Penguins usually are very flexible, and this is not. But it's a very good translation. Really brings Xenophon's voice forward, and takes him out of the realm where he's trying to write history, and into the realm I think he's much better suited for. And I think that shows in his biography. We know that he wrote a lot of so-called occasional prose. The big sweeping histories that he wrote weren't all that he wrote. They weren't even most of what he wrote. Most of what he wrote were meditations, considerations of things. And he seems, I think, to have a very good grasp of how to do that. So in turn, I should, because I love big narrative history, I should like this more than anything in here. And yet this is the volume I go back to for Xenophon. And that is your Daily Penguin for today. It was not 20 minutes. It was not a whole biography of the author. And I am not going to do a daily book from my library every day. The Penguins will have to be good enough. But we're going to stick with the Greeks a little bit longer, and then we'll start mixing things up again. So we'll stick with the Greeks tomorrow. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.